What happens when Hollywood's most fearless late-night host comes face-to-face with a royal who's grown tired of playing by the rules? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a lighthearted interview about his latest charitable endeavors, only to spiral into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two of the most outspoken personalities clash in ways nobody saw coming. The atmosphere in the Ed Sullivan Theater was electric. As Prince Harry strode onto the stage, his signature confident grin plastered across his face. The audience erupted in their typical warm applause, but seasoned Colbert watchers could sense something different in the air. Stephen's opening monologue had been particularly sharp that evening, taking subtle jabs at various public figures, and those familiar with his interviewing style knew he was in one of his more provocative moods. Welcome back to The Late Show. I'm Stephen Colbert, and joining me tonight is Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, best-selling author, and professional royal family critic, Stephen announced with his trademark smirk, already setting a tone that made Harry's jaw tighten ever so slightly. Harry settled into the guest chair, his media-trained composure intact, but there was a flash of something in his eyes that suggested he hadn't appreciated that introduction. Thanks for having me, Stephen, though I think professional critic might be a bit harsh, don't you think? Oh, I don't know, Stephen replied, leaning back in his chair with that familiar gleam that meant trouble was brewing. I mean, you've made quite a career out of telling us all about your family's dirty laundry. Some might say it's become your full-time job. The audience chuckled nervously, sensing the immediate tension. Harry's smile became more forced, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair just a fraction tighter. I prefer to think of it as truth-telling, Stephen. Something I thought journalists would appreciate. Truth-telling? Stephen repeated, savoring the words. That's interesting, because I've been reading your book again, and I have to ask, do you ever worry that your version of the truth might be, shall we say, colored by your own perspective? I mean, we're only getting one side of these very private family conversations. Harry's composure began to crack, his voice taking on a defensive edge. Are you suggesting I'm lying about my own experiences? About the racism my wife faced? About being cut off financially? These aren't perspectives, Stephen. These are facts. I'm not saying you're lying, Stephen said, his tone deceptively casual as he shuffled through his note cards. I'm just wondering if you've considered that maybe, just maybe, there might be another way to look at some of these situations. For instance, this whole thing about being cut off. Isn't it true that you and Meghan made the decision to step back from your royal duties? Isn't it possible that the financial consequences were, well, consequences of that choice? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Harry's media training was clearly being put to the test, as his jaw clenched visibly. That's an incredibly simplistic way to look at it, and frankly, it's exactly the kind of narrative that the British tabloids have been pushing. I expected better from you. Oh, so now I'm just like the British tabloids? Stephen's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. That's rich, coming from someone who's been making the media rounds for years, telling the same stories over and over again. Tell me, Harry, at what point does sharing your truth become exploitation of your family's pain? The audience was dead, silent now. The usual laughter and applause completely absent as the two men stared at each other across the desk. Harry's hands were visibly trembling with barely contained anger. Exploitation? I'm trying to break cycles of abuse and trauma. I'm trying to protect my children from the same system that failed to protect me and my brother after our mother died. Your brother, Stephen pounced on the opening. Let's talk about William for a moment. Here's a guy who's also dealing with the same system, the same pressures, the same loss of your mother, but somehow he's managed to stay and work within the institution rather than burning it all down from the outside. What makes your approach the right one and his the wrong one? Harry's face flushed red. his voice rising despite his obvious attempts to maintain control. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what William and I have been through privately, what conversations we've had, what he's had to sacrifice to maintain that perfect image. Just because he's staying quiet doesn't mean he agrees with everything that's happening. So you're speaking for him now? Stephen pressed, clearly sensing blood in the water. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've thrown your entire family under the bus for a Netflix deal and a book contract. And now you're suggesting that your brother, the future King of England, is just too weak or too compromised to stand up for what's right. That only you had the courage to break free? The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Harry's carefully constructed public persona was crumbling in real time, his anger now barely contained, as he leaned forward in his chair. How dare you reduce my family's trauma to entertainment value? You sit here in your comfortable chair, making jokes about situations you couldn't possibly understand, profiting off of other people's pain, just like everyone else in this business. Profiting off other people's pain? Stephen's voice took on a harder edge, his own composure beginning to slip. That's pretty rich coming from someone who signed a multi-million-dollar deal to air his family's private business on a global platform. At least when I make jokes about public figures, I'm not pretending it's therapy or social justice. I'm honest about what I'm doing. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, with both men now clearly beyond the point of polite disagreement. Harry's face was flushed, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage as he gripped the sides of his chair. You want honesty? Here's some honesty for you. You're just another privileged American who thinks he understands the British class system and the monarchy because you read a few articles and watch The Crown. You have no idea what it's like to grow up in that fishbowl, to have every aspect of your life scrutinized and controlled. Stephen's eyes flashed dangerously, his famous wit now weaponized into something much sharper and more personal. And you have no idea what it's like to grow up without the safety net of being born into one of the wealthiest, most privileged families on earth. But sure, let's all shed a tear for the poor prince who had to actually get a job after voluntarily giving up his royal allowance. The studio audience was completely silent now, some looking genuinely uncomfortable as they witnessed what was clearly no longer entertainment but a real, heated argument between two public figures who had completely abandoned any pretense of civility. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the escalating confrontation that was about to reach its explosive climax. Harry stood up from his chair, his face now completely flushed with anger, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Stephen. You know what? I'm done with this. I came here thinking you were different, thinking you actually cared about having real conversations about important issues. But you're just another vulture in a suit, picking at the bones of other people's suffering for your nightly ratings. Stephen rose to meet him, his own composure completely shattered as he slammed his hand down on the desk. Oh, that's beautiful. The prince is lecturing me about exploitation, while he's literally written a best-selling book about his family's private conversations. You want to talk about vultures? You've been dining on your own family's carcass for years, and now you have the audacity to come into my house and act like you're some kind of victim? The production crew stood frozen behind the cameras, unsure whether to keep rolling or intervene. This had gone far beyond anything they'd ever witnessed on the usually controlled set. Security personnel began moving closer to the stage area, but stayed back, clearly receiving instructions through their earpieces to let it play out. My house? Harry's voice cracked with incredulous laughter. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You American talk show hosts think you own the narrative, think you can dissect anyone's life like it's some kind of entertainment product. You want to know about exploitation? Let me tell you about real exploitation. It's having photographers chase your mother to her death and then spending the rest of your life watching people profit from that tragedy. The mention of Princess Diana sent a visible shockwave through the studio. Stephen's expression shifted, momentarily taken aback by the raw pain in Harry's voice, but his anger quickly reasserted itself. Don't you dare try to weaponize your mother's death to shut down legitimate criticism of your choices. That's exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that makes people question everything else you say. Your mother was a tragic figure, but using her memory to shield yourself from accountability is disgraceful. Harry's eyes blazed with fury as he took a step closer to the desk. Accountability. You want to talk about accountability? Where's your accountability for sitting here night after night, making jokes about people's real pain? Where's your accountability for turning human suffering into punchlines for your audiences? Entertainment? At least I'm trying to make something positive out of my experiences. Positive? Stephen's voice rose to match Harry's volume. You call destroying your relationship with your father positive? You call putting your grandmother through public humiliation in her final years positive? You call teaching your children that the way to handle family problems is to air them on international television positive? That's not healing, Harry. That's revenge. The audience was now visibly shifting in their seats, some people actually standing up as if preparing to leave. The energy in the room had become genuinely hostile, with both men now shouting at each other across the narrow space that separated them. Production assistants were frantically trying to get the attention of the show's producers, but everyone seemed paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding. Harry's hands were shaking as he pointed at Stephen again. You don't get to lecture me about family relationships while you sit there making a living off of mocking other people's families. You've spent years making jokes about politicians, children, about celebrities' personal struggles, about real people's real problems. But the moment someone fights back, the moment someone refuses to be your victim, suddenly you're the moral authority? I make jokes about public figures who put themselves in the public eye. Stephen shot back, his face now red with anger. You want privacy? Stop writing books. Stop doing interviews. Stop signing deals with streaming services. But you can't have it both ways. You can't profit from your story and then complain when people have opinions about it. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now completely beyond any possibility of reconciliation. Harry's voice was hoarse from shouting, his carefully maintained public image completely shattered, as he revealed the raw anger that had been building throughout the interview. You think this is about money? You think I enjoy having to relive the worst moments of my life over and over again, just so people like you can have something to talk about? I do this because someone has to break the cycle. Someone has to stand up and say, enough is enough. Stephen's response was equally heated, his professional mask completely gone, as he revealed a side of himself that viewers had never seen before. Break the cycle? You are the cycle. You're feeding the exact same machine you claim to be fighting against. Every interview, every book, every documentary, you're giving them exactly what they want. You're not breaking anything, you're just changing the terms of your own exploitation. The accusation hit Harry like a physical blow. For a moment, he stood speechless, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, more menacing than when he'd been shouting. How dare you? How dare you stand there and pretend? You understand what it's like to have your entire life turned into public property from the moment you're born. You chose this life, Stephen. You chose to be in the public eye. I never had that choice. Nobody's forcing you to stay in the public eye now. Stephen's voice reached a crescendo that echoed through the silent studio. You could disappear tomorrow, if you wanted to. You could take your family and live a quiet life somewhere, but you won't, because you're addicted to the attention, just like everyone else in this business. The only difference is you've convinced yourself that your attention-seeking is somehow noble. That final accusation broke something fundamental in Harry's composure. The prince's face went from red to pale in an instant, his entire body trembling with rage as he stared at Stephen with undisguised hatred. The studio fell into a silence, so complete that the mechanical hum of the cameras seemed deafeningly loud. Everyone present could feel that they had just witnessed the point of no return. The moment when this confrontation moved beyond heated argument into something far more dangerous and personal. For several long seconds, Harry said nothing. Breathing heavy and labored as he struggled to contain the fury that was clearly consuming him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more venom than all his previous shouting combined. Addicted to attention, that's what you think this is about. He let out a bitter laugh that sent chills through everyone in the studio. You really have no idea what you've just said, do you? Stephen, perhaps sensing he had pushed too far, tried to regain some composure, but his voice still carried the heat of his anger. Harry, look, maybe we should… No! Harry's voice exploded across the studio with such force that several audience members visibly jumped. You don't get to back down now. You wanted to psychoanalyze me on national television. You wanted to reduce my entire life struggle to some pathetic need for attention? Let me tell you something about attention, Stephen. Harry began pacing behind his chair like a caged animal, his hands gesturing wildly as years of suppressed rage poured out of him. I got attention when I was 12 years old, walking behind my mother's coffin, while the world watched. I got attention when I had a nervous breakdown in my 20s, and the tabloids called it a party phase. I got attention when I fell in love with a woman, and they tried to destroy her before she could even become my wife. The raw pain in his voice was palpable, but Stephen, still caught up in his own anger, refused to back down. And now you're getting attention by selling that pain to the highest bidder. Don't stand there and pretend you're some kind of martyr when you're literally profiting from every single thing you just mentioned. That response was the final straw. Harry stopped, pacing, and turned to face Stephen with an expression of such pure contempt that it was genuinely frightening to witness. You know what? You're absolutely right about one thing. I am addicted to something. I'm addicted to trying to find one single person in this God-forsaken media circus who might actually give a damn about the truth instead of their ratings. He reached up and began yanking off his microphone with violent, jerky movements. But you're not that person, are you, Stephen? You're just another parasite in an expensive suit, feeding off other people's misery and calling it entertainment. Well, congratulations, you got your show tonight. You got your viral moment. I hope it was worth it. The microphone pack hit the floor with a loud thud as Harry threw it down. Stephen, realizing the interview was spiraling completely out of control, made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Harry, wait. This doesn't have to end like this. We can take a break. We can… End like this? Harry's laugh was sharp and bitter as he began walking toward the edge of the stage. This is exactly how it was always going to end. You invited me here to be your dancing monkey, to perform my trauma for your audience's amusement. And when I refused to play along, you decided to try to break me down instead. The prince stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back to face Stephen one final time, his voice now carrying a cold finality that made everyone in the studio understand that this confrontation was truly over. You want to know the difference between us, Stephen? I may have been born into privilege, but at least I'm trying to use that privilege to help people, to change things for the better. You just use your platform to tear people down for sport. Stephen, his own anger still burning but now mixed with what looked like genuine regret, stood up behind his desk. That's not fair, Harry. That's not what this show is about, and you know it. Fair? Harry's voice rose one final time, echoing through the studio with devastating finality. You want to talk about fair? It's not fair that I had to bury my mother when I was a child because of people like you. It's not fair that my wife was driven to the point of suicide by the media circus that you're all a part of. It's not fair that my children will grow up having to read about their grandfather's private conversations in my book because that was the only way anyone would listen. The emotional weight of that admission seemed to drain all the fight out of him. Harry's shoulders sagged as he looked around the studio one last time, taking in the shocked faces of the audience, the crew members standing frozen at their positions, and finally Stephen, who was staring at him with an expression that was difficult to read. But you know what's really not fair? Harry's voice had dropped to almost a whisper again, but in the complete silence of the studio, every word was crystal clear. The fact that I actually thought you might be different. I thought maybe, just maybe, there was someone in this business who could see past the headlines and the sound bites and actually have a real conversation about the things that matter. He shook his head slowly, a gesture that seemed to encompass not just disappointment in Stephen, but in the entire media landscape that had shaped his life. I was wrong. You're all the same. Every single one of you. With that final condemnation, Prince Harry turned and walked off the stage without another word, leaving behind a studio full of people who were still processing what they had just witnessed. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence as he disappeared into the wings, followed moments later by the slam of a door that seemed to reverberate through the entire theater. Stephen remained standing behind his desk, staring at the empty space where his guest had been just moments before. The camera continued rolling, capturing his stunned expression as he struggled to process what had just happened. For perhaps the first time in his career, the quick-witted host was completely speechless. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, leave, or simply continue staring at the stage where one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history had just played out. Some were pulling out their phones, undoubtedly already posting about what they had witnessed, while others simply sat in shock. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Stephen finally found his voice. "We're going to take a break," he said quietly, his usual theatrical energy completely absent. "We'll be right back." But everyone in that studio knew that nothing would ever be quite the same after what they had just witnessed. The confrontation between Stephen Colbert and Prince Harry had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, revealing truths and animosities that would resonate far beyond the walls of the Ed Sullivan Theater. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the only sound was the nervous murmur of audience members discussing what they had just seen, their voices mixing together into a buzz of disbelief and shock that would follow this explosive encounter long after the last person had left the building.